A fork in the road is a moment of divergence, a decision point. One version of the phrase traces back to an old Russian tale. In the story, a knight on horseback reaches the end of a path and finds a sign. If you go right, you will lose your horse. If you go left, you will lose your head. A fork is not just a choice, it is a consequence. Over the past couple weeks, in conversations with executive leaders and consultants navigating the age of AI, I've started to feel something shift. It is clear that the technology is moving fast. But what is just as noticeable, once you start looking for it, is how quickly the narrative around that technology is beginning to diverge. We are arriving at a fork. On one side, AI is framed as leverage, expansion, a tool to accelerate what's possible. On the other, AI is framed as threat, displacement, something happening to us. And if you pause for a moment and actually look around, you can see both narratives playing out in real time. Scroll LinkedIn and you will find them sitting side by side. One post celebrating the magic of AI, the next warning of its consequences. Listen to the news and AI shows up as a risk to society. Listen to entrepreneurs and it shows up as the greatest unlock in decades. This signal is not subtle, but it is easy to miss if you are not paying attention. Because most people are not consciously choosing a narrative, they are absorbing one. That is what makes this moment important. I'm not here to tell you which perspective is right, but I am here to tell you this. The narrative you adopt will shape how you respond. And inside organizations, that response becomes everything, because the incentives for AI adoption are already locked in. This is not a debate organizations get to opt out of. AI has moved from experiment to infrastructure. It is embedding itself into the software, workflows, and expectations that define how work gets done. What was once encouraged is quickly becoming expected. What felt like an edge case is now becoming the default. And as that shift takes hold, something more subtle begins to matter. The internal narrative leaders and teams carry about AI, because that narrative does not stay abstract. It shows up in how people engage, in how willing they are to experiment, in how much resistance surfaces in the attitudes and beliefs about what is possible. It shapes what actually happens inside your organization. You can see it if you look closely enough. In one organization, a leadership team gathers to discuss how AI might be integrated into their workflows. The conversation starts with potential risks. Concerns about data privacy, job displacement, and governance quickly take center stage. The tone becomes cautious. Someone suggests forming a committee to evaluate tools. Another recommends waiting for clearer policies from legal. The conversation continues to layer in perspectives, each one reinforcing the need to be thoughtful, safe, aligned, and careful. The meeting ends with agreement that another committee should be set up to ensure alignment, and that everyone is fully bought in before moving forward. Nothing is wrong with the thinking. It is responsible, but nothing moves. In another organization, a similar conversation unfolds. The same risks are acknowledged. Data privacy comes up. So does the potential impact on roles. But the conversation does not stop there. One person volunteers to take accountability for results and offers to own a low-risk use case. That simple act shifts the energy in the room. Others begin to lean in. A small group is encouraged to test tools and share what they learn, not with the pressure to get it right, but with the understanding that the goal is learning. Failure is not framed as failure. It is framed as feedback. The meeting ends with action and a narrative centered around moving forward. Nothing is fully figured out, but something has started. You see versions of this dynamic playing out across organizations right now. And the question is, why? Because in many cases, these are smart teams, experienced leaders, people who understand both the risks and the opportunities. And yet, they default to caution. They slow down, they wait, they build structure before movement. Which makes sense if you understand the assumptions most organizations have been operating under for years. That technology takes time to adopt. That moving too fast introduces unnecessary risk. That alignment must come before action. That committees and consensus are the way to bring people forward together. For a long time, those assumptions made sense. They created stability. They reduced risk. They helped organizations coordinate at scale. But in a moment where the pace of change is accelerating, many of those constraints are beginning to break down. Not all at once, and not everywhere, but enough that they are no longer as reliable as they once were. And yet, inside most organizations, they persist, not because they are consciously chosen, but because they are embedded in the way people think, speak, and make decisions. What begins to replace them is not the absence of structure, but a different posture, one that favors learning through action over alignment before it. And if you trace this pattern far enough, you begin to see two very different interpretations of what this all means. This week, I'm sharing two books that sit on opposite ends of that spectrum, each offering a distinct lens on what AI represents and where it might lead. But before we jump into the signals, let me take a minute to introduce myself if you are new here. My name is Chris Schmelzer, and I serve leaders who recognize the need and understand that the old models of leading and working are no longer keeping up with the pace of change. Every week, I track the subtle signals that a massive reset is coming for what we refer to as white-collar work, and share thoughts on how to lead yourself and your organization through the age of accelerating change. If you find any value in this video, like it, share your comments below, and subscribe. All right, two signals from this week. The first signal, the book We Are as Gods. We Are as Gods by Peter Diamandis and Stephen Kotler offers one of the clearest expressions of the optimistic side of this fork. At the center of their argument is a simple idea. We are entering an exponential century where technologies like AI are not just improving, but compounding in ways that accelerate change beyond our intuition. As these technologies converge, they begin to unlock capabilities that would have felt unimaginable not long ago. Intelligence can be generated on demand. Complex problems can be explored in minutes. The boundary between thinking and execution begins to collapse. This is what they mean when they say we are becoming as gods. Not in a mythical sense, but in a practical one. We now have the ability to shape and create at a level that was once reserved for time, nature, or chance. From this vantage point, the question begins to shift. It is no longer just, will AI take my job? It becomes, what can AI help me do? But for leaders, the question does not stop there. It expands. What does this make possible for how we design work, structure teams, and make decisions? How do roles evolve when intelligence itself is on demand? What changes when the constraint is no longer access to expertise, but how quickly it can be applied? Because once AI moves from tool to infrastructure, it doesn't just change output, it changes the shape of the organization. And from this perspective, AI is not simply a productivity enhancer. It is a forcing function, one that begins to challenge long-held assumptions about how work gets done, how teams are organized, and where value is actually created. Inside organizations, this narrative creates a different kind of energy. There is curiosity, a willingness to experiment, a bias toward learning in motion. Teams operating from this posture do not wait for certainty. They begin, and over time, that posture starts to compound. The signal. When AI is framed as possibility, organizations don't just adopt tools, they begin to challenge the assumptions their work was built on. The second signal, the book If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies. There is another narrative forming at the same time, one that looks at the exact same trajectory and arrives at a very different conclusion. It is captured in the argument behind If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies, from AI researcher Eliezer Yudkowsky. The concern is not that AI becomes evil. It is that we are building systems that are increasingly powerful, increasingly autonomous, and not fully understood. Modern AI systems are not engineered in the traditional sense. They are trained, grown, developed, and shaped through massive datasets and feedback loops that even their creators cannot fully explain. They can produce extraordinary results, but their internal reasoning remains opaque and hard to understand. As these systems become more capable, they also become more independent. They move from tools that respond to prompts to agents that can plan, act, and pursue outcomes autonomously over time. From this perspective, the risk is not intent alone, it is capability without full control. And the path forward relies on a fragile assumption that we will learn how to align and manage these systems before they reach a level where we no longer can. Inside organizations, this narrative shows up differently. Conversations become more cautious, adoption slows, leaders focus on control, governance, and protection. Not how do we use this, but how do we contain it? And while that posture may feel responsible, it carries a consequence. Because in a moment where speed and learning compound advantage, hesitation does not stand still. It falls behind. The signal. When AI is framed as threat, organizations don't just manage risk. They reinforce the assumptions that slow them down. We are facing profound questions, and the answers we choose, both individually and collectively, will carry real consequences. That is the fork in the road. We have reached it. And while the broader debate will continue to play out across headlines, podcasts, and boardrooms, something more immediate is already unfolding inside organizations. AI is not slowing down. It is moving, often quietly, into the infrastructure of how work gets done. What began as experimentation is becoming expectation. What once felt optional is now embedding itself into the everyday rhythms of decision-making, communication, and execution. Which means the question is no longer whether this shift is happening. It is how people in the organization are meeting it. And that is where this becomes less about technology and more about interpretation. Because whatever story you are carrying about AI does not stay contained. It begins to move through the way you frame conversations, through the questions you ask, through the tone you bring when something uncertain or unfamiliar enters the room. And that is the decision point. Because whether you realize it or not, a narrative is already forming inside your team. It is being shaped not just by what happens inside your organization, but by what your people are exposed to outside of it, through headlines, social feeds, and the algorithms that determine what they see. Some are being pulled toward curiosity and possibility, others toward fear and resistance. It is shaping how people engage, what they believe is possible, and how quickly they move. The only real question is whether you are willing to see it, and once you see it, whether you are willing to choose it. The organizations and teams that differentiate themselves during this period will be able to surface the invisible assumptions in their language patterns. The words we use matter more than most of us are aware. Adopting language with generative patterns helps those around you move forward with more exploration, curiosity, and openness. If you want to learn how to do that, check out this week's sponsor, Anicha. Anicha is an AI tool that analyzes your real conversations and gives you feedback on how you're actually showing up. Not how you think you are, but what the data shows. It looks at patterns like generative versus constrictive language, talk time versus listen time, questions versus statements, clarity versus abstraction, so you can begin to see the patterns that are shaping your conversations and your outcomes. Sign up to start analyzing the hidden patterns in your language at web.anicha.app.